Alright, so we're going to start our first part of our chapter 23 lecture on animal tissues and organ systems in the animal body. This is going to be our first look at what amounts to a mini A&P or anatomy and physiology class to see what kinds of organ systems are out there and how they might function in an animal. So this chapter is kind of the groundwork for everything else we're about to see for the next several chapters, looking at how the vertebrate body is organized, and we are focusing on vertebrates here. Later on in the course, we may see a few other things as well, but for right now, we are focusing on vertebrates. In other words, we're looking at things like birds and mammals and fishes and amphibians and reptiles. So that's kind of our first step, is to look at the organization of how the vertebrate body is set up. Now, within an individual organism, as we've seen before, all the way back in chapter 1, right, we talked about cells, we talked about tissues and organ systems, and from there we actually have the organism itself. Now, within the human body, for example, just as an example, there are about 210 different cell types, so there's a whole bunch of different kinds of cells that comprise our bodies. But if you look at just the levels of tissues that we have, there are only 4 different kinds of tissues in the human body. We also need to look at cell-to-cell connections, right? So sometimes you might want to have, and we've seen this before, we saw this before back in, chapter 3, right? When we talked about cell-to-cell connections, tight junctions versus adhesion junctions, or I believe we call them desmosomes back in chapter 3, as well as gap junctions, depending on if you want to have more of a waterproof connection between cells, or if you want to have more of a strong connection between cells, like in the skin or in muscles, for example, or even if you want to have a type of connection where there's a lot of cell-to-cell communication, when you have, for example, cardiac cells or heart cells that need to be able to talk to each other so that you actually do get a sustained heartbeat, right? So you want the heart to all contract, is the heart muscle to contract all as one single functional unit. You want the cells to be able to communicate very, very well so that the heart does contract as a single functional unit, right? So we see tight junctions in the urinary bladder, for example. We see adhesion junctions in the skin and in skeletal muscle, for example. And we see gap junctions in places like cardiac muscle, for example. All right, so we have different tissues. I mentioned a second ago before that last slide that we have 4 different tissue types. In the vertebrate body, we have epithelial tissue, we have connective tissue, we have muscle tissue, and we have nervous tissue. And that's kind of what most of this chapter is set up to look like. Now, we're going to see in the upcoming chapters a variety of different respiratory and digestive and urinary and circulatory organs and organ systems and so forth, but they're all based on these tissue types, right? So we're going to be looking at a lot of this anatomy and a little bit of the physiology that goes along with the vertebrate body. All right, so tissues are, of course, as we defined it back in chapter 1, groups of cells that work together to accomplish some sort of task. They're specializing, they're dividing the labor, they're doing some type of job that's different from what other tissues do. During development, that is when you're an embryo, initially, very, very early on, after conception, these tissues come from what we call germ layers. And germ layers are the endoderm and mesoderm and ectoderm that make up the layers of the embryo during a stage of development we call gastrulation, which we'll see much later on in the course. Gastrulation is where the embryo actually starts to specialize and different tissues begin to take on their specific functions. So the endoderm is the part of the organism closest to the inside. The endoderm eventually gives rise to the digestive tract and a few other kind of secondary systems. Mesoderm is sort of located in the middle. In this picture, it's the pinkish reddish color in this particular diagram here. Mesoderm is going to become, among other things, the skeletal system and the muscle system. And then on the outside, we have the ectoderm, which gives rise to, among other things, the epithelial tissues as well as the nervous system of the animal. Right? So we talked about 4 different tissue types: epithelial, connective, muscle, and nervous. And that's really the bulk of this chapter, is looking at how those different tissues are set up, unique features of them, and some of the tasks that they have to accomplish. Now, in relation to organs, organs are, of course, made up of tissues. So if you have more than one tissue type in the same place at the same time, you have an organ. So if you look at, for example, the heart actually has all 4 of the 4 tissue types. It has, obviously, muscle, right? It's got some connective tissue, it's got nervous tissue, and it has covering layers or epithelial tissue as well. So it's got all 4 types. If you look at the brain has 3 out of the 4 tissue types. It doesn't have the muscle, but it has connective and epithelial and obviously nervous tissue as well. Once you have multiple organs working together, then we can start talking about organ systems. And in the vertebrate body, in most cases, we are talking about 11 different organ systems, although we won't necessarily go through all of those in this class. But we'll take a look certainly at several of them as we go through the upcoming chapters before we start getting into plants. The body cavities of the animal are involved in several aspects. In addition to just containing the organs and keeping those in place, we also have protection. There is some degree of movement that takes place of organs past one another, and a certain degree of flexibility when it comes to movement for the vertebrate animal itself. And we have two main primary body cavities. The dorsal body cavity, start with the dorsal first. Dorsal body cavity is made up of the cranium and the spinal cord. Actually, the spinal cord, the spinal column, the vertebrae that surround the spinal cord. So your vertebrae, for example, are part of your dorsal body cavity. The cranium and vertebrae that contain the brain and spinal cord respectively make up your dorsal body cavity. Your ventral body cavity is made up of your thoracic cavity, which is everything above your diaphragm, everything above the sheet of muscle that runs kind of below your chest. We have thoracic body cavity, and we have an abdominopelvic cavity. Right? So those are the two subcavities that make up the overall ventral body cavity. Thoracic body cavity can then be broken down into the pericardial and pleural cavities. So pericardial will be the area around the heart, and pleural cavities would be the areas that surround the lungs. And notice how the pleural cavity is, there's two of them, right? So they're independent of each other, and each one encompasses its own lung. So if there's damage to one of the two, for example, the other one can, in many cases, continue to work as it would normally. So pleural cavity surrounds the lungs, pericardial surrounds the heart. The abdominal cavity is everything below or posterior to the diaphragm, and it includes, among other things, the digestive and urinary and reproductive systems. So those are going to be found further down here in the abdominal cavity. Dorsal body cavity, like I mentioned, is the cranium and spinal column. So we have the cranial cavity, we have the spinal cavity surrounding the brain and spinal cord respectively, for the most part helping to protect them, but also to help them function more efficiently as well. So we're going to start off our discussion of the four tissue types. Later on we'll get into organs, but right now we're looking at tissue types. And the first one we're going to look at is epithelial tissue. And epithelial tissue is, like I mentioned I think a second ago, is a covering tissue type. It covers surfaces of the body on the inside as well as on the outside of the body. The skin is made up of epithelial tissue to a degree, but there's also epithelial tissue lining different layers inside the body as well. The layer of your intestine that's in contact with the lumen, or the place where the digested food goes by, is lined with epithelial tissue. In fact, all of the internal organs are lined with epithelial tissue. So it's not just found like on the outside part of the body, right? It's also located within the body as well. Epithelial tissue can come from any of the three germ layers. So if we're talking about digestive epithelial tissue, that would have come from the endoderm. If we're dealing with epithelium that covers muscles, that would come from the mesoderm. And if we're dealing with skin and the associated epithelial tissue there, that would have come from the ectoderm. Right? So it could come from any of those three germ layers. And this is also where glands come from. Any glands that we deal with, whether it's the pituitary glands or adrenal glands or anything like that, those are also derived from epithelial tissue that functions a bit differently than the other types that we'll see. In any case, these cells are very, very tightly bound together, whether they're glandular, whether they're covering tissues. They're very, very tightly bound to help them do their job more efficiently and more effectively. They're really, really good at forming a barrier against invading agents or protection, right? So preventing damage to the internal organs within. Epithelium does a pretty good job of doing that as well. Of the four different tissue types, the epithelium is the one that's best able to repair itself. If you think about the wear and tear that your skin goes through, if you think about the wear and tear that the lining of your intestine goes through, the lining of your stomach goes through, those cells have to be really, really good at replacing themselves. They are actually quite good at dividing, replacing themselves. If we think about connective tissue, not so much. I mean, some connective tissues are okay. If you look at blood or bone, which are connective tissues, they're pretty good at regenerating. But if you look at something like a tendon or a ligament or cartilage, those are also types of connective tissues. They're not really all that well known for their ability to regenerate or repair. If you think about muscle tissue, right? If you tear a muscle, if you have damage to cardiac muscle, those damages do not repair very effectively because those cells don't divide all that well. Same thing with nervous tissue. If you have a brain injury, if you have a spinal cord injury, those injuries are extremely long-term, if not permanent, because those tissue types do not regenerate very well. Epithelium, on the other hand, does. Right? So typically what you'll find is epithelium, which is anchored to connective tissue by a membrane. And then we can look at both the basal and apical side of that epithelial tissue. The side of the tissue that's connected to the connective tissue is the basal side. The epithelium that sticks off into the environment, whether the environment is inside or outside the body, is the free side. It's the apical side. All right, so there's a very different, what amounts to polarity or a difference in function for the two different sides of the epithelium, whether it's being attached or whether it's protecting the body, secreting gland hormones, things like that. The two different sides, basal and apical, are very, very important. We can look at epithelial tissue in a lot of ways, based on its structure, based on its shape. We can look at what's called simple epithelium, where the tissue is made up of a single layer of cells. Like in the top picture up here, the lining of the lungs is a single layer of cells. We do not want multiple layers here because although it might be more durable, it would also represent a much greater distance for things like oxygen and CO2 to cross. It would take a lot longer for diffusion. As we've seen before, usually you don't want diffusion to take very long. You want it to be quick. So in the lungs, where you're trying to do a lot of gas exchange, you want to have a thin layer of cells there to help maximize rate of diffusion. On the other hand, the bottom picture is showing you stratified epithelium, where we've got multiple layers, at least 3 or 4 living layers of cells, and then 2 or 3 layers of dead cells on top of that, or dying cells on top of that. Multiple layers is called stratified epithelium. And then within each of those two classes, we can take a look at the shape of the cells. So we can talk about squamous cells or squamous cells, depending on who you talk to, which are flat. They're almost scale-like in a sense, the squamous cells. We can look at cuboidal cells, which are more or less box-shaped. So when you think cuboidal, think cube or box, roughly the same length and width. And so those are going to be found in different types of locations, in different contexts, doing different types of jobs in the body. We can also find what are called columnar cells, and columnar cells are long and skinny. So we'll take a look at some places where we'll find columnar cells as well. So again, you can have, just on this slide, 6 different cell types. You could have simple squamous, simple cuboidal, simple columnar. You could have stratified squamous, stratified cuboidal, or stratified columnar. So you can have any of those combinations when it comes to number of layers of cells as well as the shape of those cells. Okay, so we have, we're starting off with simple squamous epithelium. We'll do that one first. These are in places, these cells, these tissues are in places where you want to be able to have maximum exchange of something. So if you're dealing with exchange of gases, oxygen, CO2, those kinds of things, you want to have a very, very thin layer of very, very thin cells. And that's a place for simple squamous epithelium to do a good job. They're not strong, they're not tough, they're not durable, they don't take a lot of wear and tear, but they're very delicate, they're very thin, and they're very, very good at allowing materials to pass through. So lung lining of your alveoli, the air sacs in your lungs, as well as the lining of your capillaries tends to be simple squamous epithelium because that represents a shorter distance for these gases to cover. Simple cuboidal epithelium is often found in glands, and it's also found in the kidney tubules. So when we start looking at nephrons and the functioning of how they help the body do osmoregulation and maintain ion balance and so forth, we'll be looking at nephrons and kidney tubules and simple cuboidal cells in that chapter. And then simple columnar cells line the upper respiratory tract and most of the gastrointestinal tract, except for the places where you want to have a lot of absorption. You're going to find a lot of simple columnar epithelium. So that's a pretty common one there as well. And this one, simple columnar, is often associated with what are called goblet cells that produce mucus. So in the intestine, that mucus helps to lubricate material as it's moving through your intestines. In the upper respiratory tract, that mucus is going to help trap any foreign particles that you might have breathed in, whether it's fungal spores or pollen or neighbor skin cells, whatever gross things you might be breathing in. That mucus is going to help trap those particles. And then cilia inside the upper respiratory tract can help move that mucus and the trapped particles up and out of your respiratory tract so that they don't get down to where you really, really don't want them to be. So that's our 3 categories of simple epithelium. We have simple squamous here, relatively thin, 1 layer, very delicate, lots of exchange, very dynamic in terms of what kinds of things can move across the simple squamous epithelium. We can look at simple cuboidal, which you find again in the kidneys. We find it in various glands as well. And then we have simple columnar epithelium where we see, like we said, lining of the stomach and the intestines and the respiratory tract, along with the goblet cells too that are producing that mucus. Glands are formed by what are called invaginated epithelial cells, which are cells that have kind of wrapped over or folded over themselves. We have two different types of glandular cells. There are exocrine cells as well as endocrine cells. Exocrine cells typically are those that are connected to the epithelium by a duct. These are going to be glands that release their substances out to the outside world. And when I say the outside world, yes, that could be the surface of the skin, but it could also be substances that are in the intestinal tract, because technically the space inside your stomach, inside your intestines, is still considered outside your body. It's even though it's inside, it's actually outside your body when it comes to how this is all considered with anatomy and physiology. Sweat glands, sebaceous glands, which are oil glands that you have through over most of your body, except for the palms of your hands and the soles of your feet. You have oil glands, and also salivary glands, because even though you secrete saliva into your mouth, the environment inside your mouth is still considered to be part of the outside environment. You could even look at the function of the pancreas in some context as a type of exocrine gland, because the pancreas secretes digestive substances into your intestine. And again, the space in your intestine is still considered to be outside your body. So when the pancreas is producing amylase or lipase or protease or bicarbonate, those kinds of things, it would be considered an exocrine gland in that context. Endocrine glands, on the other hand, do not have a duct to the outside world. They lose it as they're developing, and the secretions they produce go into the blood. So they are technically released into the body, into the bloodstream. So most of the traditional endocrine glands you think of would be like adrenal glands and pituitary glands and thyroid glands and parathyroid glands and all those kinds of things, because their secretions go directly into the blood. When the pancreas is producing insulin after a carbohydrate-rich meal, your pancreas produces insulin if things are working properly. That insulin goes into your blood. So in that context, then, the pancreas is actually considered an endocrine gland. Right? So the pancreas is a really good example of an organ or a gland that can be both exocrine and endocrine depending on what it's doing at any given moment in time. It can do both. Stratified epithelium, again, is made up of two or more layers. It has to be at least two layers, if not more. And the way it's classified is based on the apical or unattached side of the tissue. The epidermis itself is stratified squamous epithelium, so you want to have multiple layers because, of course, that skin is subject to all kinds of stresses, whether it's mechanical, abrasion, heat, cold, cuts and nicks and those kinds of things. The skin takes a tremendous beating. You want to have multiple layers of cells there to help sustain that damage and prevent damage to layers below. In terrestrial vertebrates, which would be things like reptiles and birds and mammals, the skin, or the stratified squamous epithelium, is keratinized. And keratin is a protein that you find in your fingernails, toenails. It's a protein you find in your hair. It's a protein, if you're a reptile, that you find in your scales. It's a protein in a bird. If you're a bird, you find that in your feathers. It's a really, really common kind of a protein. We also find it in our skin. And what that does is it helps to waterproof our skin so that we don't lose too much water across the surface of our skin. Just about one of the only places in your body where you're going to find non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium would be on your lips. And if you think about what your lips are used for, right? You've got talking, you've got eating. You want to have some sensitivity there. You want to have some pliability there. It wouldn't be good to have this relatively tough, water impermeable substance coating the skin of your lips because you'd lose a lot of the sensitivity in your lips. The drawback to that of having non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium is that in the wintertime, of course, your lips dry out. Because the keratin is not there, water loss is going to be more substantial, and of course your lips get all dried out and chapped, which can be no fun. So those are simple versus stratified epithelium. Membranes as well. We find a lot of membranes that line the body cavities, organ surfaces. These are, again, very thin but substantial layers of epithelium that are connected to the organs below through connective tissues. We'll see that later on when we look at the structure of the stomach, for example. We'll see epithelium and connective tissue and as well as muscle in the inside of the stomach. Mucous membranes are those where we find passageways to the outside of the body. So mucous membranes would be like in your nasal cavity. They would be your eyes. They would be your mouth. Various places that line exits or openings to the outside of the body would be lined by mucous membranes. Again, we have sort of that filtering aspect to help keep things out that we don't want getting into the body. We also have serous membranes, which line the thoracic cavity and the abdominal cavities. We'll see serosal membranes in the digestive tract primarily in this class. We'll see a fairly substantial serous membrane there with digestion. We have synovial membranes, which are extremely thin, but they're going to help us provide smoother movement in the joints. Very thin layers of epithelium that help joints move freely past one another. So especially like in your elbow and your shoulder and your knees and your hips, there are synovial membranes which help to cushion the joints and allow them to move more smoothly so you're not having bone grinding on bone inside your joints. And then also cutaneous membrane, which would be like your skin, which of course is on the outside of your body. So lots of different kinds of membranes here to look at. As far as the skin and what that does, the skin, the integumentary system, the skin by itself is the body's largest organ system. A lot of people forget to think about the skin when you start thinking organ systems. We call it the integumentary system. An integument is a layer of tissue that covers something, and the skin, of course, covers most of the rest of our body. So we have, with the functions of skin, we have things like defense. It's a very good barrier to the entry of all kinds of really nasty critters that might otherwise get in and cause an infection or infestation of some kind. There's waterproofing. There's regulation in body temperature. Well, how does your skin regulate body temperature? Well, if you're overheating, for example, what you can do is you can move blood closer to the surface of your skin and act more like a radiator. So heat can be given off into the environment as blood moves closer to the surface of the skin. If you're cold, you can move blood closer to the core and keep it away from your skin to help conserve heat. So it does actually have a pretty substantial role when it comes to thermal regulation. We have vitamin D synthesis taking place in the skin. We have sensory stimuli. There are sensory neurons in the skin to help pick up all different kinds of stimuli, whether it's pressure, pain, heat, cold, those kinds of things. There are all kinds of sensory receptors in the skin, so it's very much involved with passing information off to the nervous system. We have excretion of things from the skin as well. We talked about oils, secretions of that nature, sweat, those kinds of things, so we have a role to play there as well. So we're going to cut off here, and we'll pick up the next section here shortly. I just want to try to keep this lecture at a reasonable length, if at all possible.